The moment I found that hidden room behind the stone fireplace, I realized my dream home had been keeping someone else's nightmare secret for over 50 years. I'm Cordelia Hayes, and 3 weeks ago I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. I had just bought a gorgeous 1970s stone mansion in Vermont for half its market value. The real estate agent kept emphasizing what a steal it was, how the previous owner's estate just wanted it gone quickly. I should have asked why. The house stood like a fortress against the mountainside, its gray stone walls covered in decades of ivy that made it look like something from a fairy tale. When I first walked through those heavy oak doors, I felt this overwhelming sense of coming home. The soaring ceilings, the massive stone fireplace that dominated the living room, the way afternoon light streamed through the tall windows and painted everything golden. It was everything I had dreamed of since I was a little girl sketching my future home in the margins of my school notebooks. I'm an art restoration specialist, which means I spend my days bringing forgotten beauty back to life. I've always believed that old things have stories to tell, that there's magic in preserving what others might throw away. My grandmother Theodora used to say that houses choose their owners, not the other way around. Standing in that living room for the first time, surrounded by all that stone and history, I felt chosen. But I also felt something else, something I couldn't quite name at the time. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Beatrice, had lived there alone for decades. According to the neighbors, she rarely left the property and never had visitors. When she passed away, her distant relatives couldn't wait to get rid of the place. They dropped the price twice before I came along. My younger brother Garrison thought I was out of my mind. During our phone call the night before I signed the papers, he said, "Cord, you're talking about buying a house that's been basically abandoned for years, in the middle of nowhere. Don't you think there's a reason nobody else wanted it?" I laughed it off then, told him he was being dramatic. I wish I had listened to that warning in his voice. The day I moved in, I remember standing in the living room with boxes stacked around me, looking up at that magnificent stone fireplace. It was easily 8 feet wide and built from the same gray stone as the exterior walls. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The proportions seemed wrong somehow, like it was too deep or too wide for the space. But I was exhausted from the move and chalked it up to my overactive imagination. That first night, I made myself dinner in the spacious kitchen and ate it sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by moving boxes, planning where everything would go. The house felt so quiet, so peaceful. I thought I had found my sanctuary, my place to finally build the life I wanted. I had no idea I was sitting just a few feet away from where someone else's life had been stolen. If I had known what I would find behind that wall, would I still have bought the house? The honest answer is yes. Because what I discovered wasn't just a secret that had been buried for 50 years. It was proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit refuses to be broken. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to be the one who finally sets the truth free. Growing up, I spent every summer at my grandmother Theodora's Victorian house in New Hampshire, watching her restore antique furniture in her workshop. She taught me that old things have souls, that they absorb the love and pain of everyone who touched them. "Cordelia," she'd say while sanding down a century-old table, "when you work with your hands to bring something back to life, you become part of its story." I never imagined how literally I would live those words. For 8 years after college, I rented a shoebox apartment in Boston's North End while working as a restoration specialist for the Museum of Fine Arts. My days were spent breathing life back into damaged paintings and sculptures, but my evenings were spent scrolling through real estate listings, dreaming of a place where I could finally spread out my own art studio. Every month, I'd deposit whatever was left after rent and student loans into my someday house savings account, watching it grow painfully slowly. Everything changed when Theodora passed away last spring. She left me her entire estate with a note that said, "Buy something with history, sweetheart, make it yours." Suddenly, I had enough for a down payment on something real, something permanent. That's when I found the listing for the Whitmore estate. The photos online showed a sprawling stone mansion nestled against the Green Mountains, about 2 hours north of where I grew up. Built in 1973, the listing said, by architect Edmund Whitmore as a private residence. The description mentioned unique period details and original architectural elements, but what caught my attention was the price. Houses like this in Vermont usually went for well over $500,000. This one was listed at $250,000. When I called the listing agent, a woman named Patricia, she seemed almost surprised that someone was interested. "It's been on the market for 8 months," she admitted. The previous owner, Beatrice Carlyle, lived there alone for nearly 20 years. Sweet old lady, but very private. When she passed, her family just wants it sold quickly. The drive up to see the house felt like traveling back in time. I left the highway and wound through increasingly narrow roads until I was surrounded by nothing but forest and mountains. When the house finally came into view, I had to pull over just to stare. The stone walls rose 3 stories high, covered in ivy that had been growing wild for years. Tall windows reflected the late afternoon sky, and that massive front door looked like the entrance to a castle. Patricia met me in the circular driveway, fumbling with an enormous ring of keys. "Fair warning," she said as we approached the front door. "The house has been empty for 3 years. Some rooms feel a bit cold and a few doors stick. Nothing that can't be fixed with some maintenance." The moment I stepped inside, I knew this was my house. The entryway soared 2 stories high, with a grand staircase that curved up to the 2nd floor. But it was the living room that took my breath away. The entire back wall was dominated by this incredible stone fireplace, easily the most beautiful feature in the house. The stones were arranged in a complex pattern that must have taken months to complete, and the mantel was carved from a single piece of granite. As we toured the rest of the house, Patricia seemed eager to move quickly through certain areas. When I asked about the basement, she said it was mostly storage space and not worth seeing. When I mentioned wanting to see the original blueprints or architectural plans, she said the family didn't have any records. But none of that mattered to me. I was already imagining my easel set up near those tall windows, my restored furniture arranged throughout these spacious rooms. I called my father Donovan that evening from my hotel room. "Dad, I found it. I found my house." I could hear the smile in his voice when he said, "Tell me about it, sweetheart." But when I mentioned the name Whitmore Estate, he went quiet for a long moment. "Edmund Whitmore built that house, you said?" His tone had changed completely. "Cordelia, maybe you should look at a few other properties before you decide." But I had already decided. The next morning, I made an offer for the full asking price, and by that afternoon it was accepted. Patricia seemed relieved rather than excited about the quick sale, which struck me as odd at the time. Most agents celebrate when a property moves that fast. 3 weeks later, I was loading my life into a moving truck, ready to start over in my stone sanctuary. If only I had known that I wasn't the first woman to fall in love with that house, and I wasn't the first to think those stone walls would keep me safe. My first week in the house felt like a honeymoon period. I spent my days unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, marveling at how the afternoon light transformed each room into something magical. But by the 2nd week, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. It began with the living room. When I tried to push my grandmother's antique sofa against the wall near the fireplace, it wouldn't sit flush. There was clearly space behind the wall, but when I looked at the room from the outside, the proportions seemed wrong. The exterior wall was at least 4 feet thicker than it should have been. I told myself it was probably just extra insulation or some quirky 1970s building technique. Then I found the basement stairs. I had been putting off exploring the basement because Patricia had dismissed it so quickly during the tour. But when my internet installation required running cables down there, I finally ventured below. The basement was larger than I expected, with stone walls that matched the house's exterior. But tucked away in a far corner, behind a stack of old paint cans, I discovered a collection of personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to Beatrice. There were clothes from the 1970s, still folded neatly in a vintage suitcase. A jewelry box filled with delicate pieces that looked expensive, and underneath it all, wrapped in plastic, was a leather-bound diary with VW embossed in gold on the cover. My hands shook as I opened it. The first entry was dated June 15, 1973. "Edmund says this house will be our paradise, just the 2 of us against the world. I've never seen him so happy as when he talks about our new life here." The handwriting was elegant, hopeful, but as I flipped through the pages, the tone began to change. October 1973. "Edmund doesn't like when I go to town alone anymore. He says the local people don't understand our kind of love, that they're jealous of what we have." December 1973. "I wanted to visit my sister Delphine for Christmas, but Edmund says the roads are too dangerous. We haven't left the property in 6 weeks." February 1974. "I tried to call Delphine today, but the phone line has been disconnected. Edmund says there's been a problem with the service, but when I walked to the main road, I saw the repair truck working on our neighbor's line just fine." The final entry was dated March 15, 1974. "He doesn't know I've found his secret room. I thought the wall behind the fireplace sounded hollow because of the chimney, but today I discovered there's a space back there. A space with a lock on the outside. Tomorrow I leave this place forever with or without his permission. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those words. His secret room. I walked downstairs in my pajamas and stood in front of the massive fireplace, running my hands along the stone wall. When I knocked on it, the sound was definitely hollow in some places and solid in others. I called my father the next morning. Donovan has always been my voice of reason, the person I turn to when the world doesn't make sense. But when I mentioned the name Edmund Whitmore, he went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dad, are you there?" "Cordelia, where did you hear that name?" "He built this house. Why, do you know him?" Another long pause. "We worked on a project together in 1974, just briefly. There were rumors about his wife disappearing. People said she just up and left him, but her family never believed it. They said she would never leave without telling her sister." "What kind of rumors?" "The kind you don't repeat unless you know they're true. But Cordelia, Edmund Whitmore was not a good man. He was controlling, possessive. The few times I met his wife, she seemed scared of her own shadow." That conversation changed everything. I spent the next few days researching, calling the local historical society, digging through newspaper archives. What I found made my blood run cold. Vivienne Whitmore, age 24, reported missing March 16, 1974. Last seen at the Whitmore estate. Police investigation concluded she left voluntarily after an argument with her husband. Case closed within 2 weeks. But there was more. Vivienne's sister Delphine had filed multiple reports claiming Vivienne would never disappear without contact. She had driven down from Montreal 3 times, demanding the police search the property more thoroughly. Each time, she was told that Edmund was cooperating fully and there was no evidence of foul play. Standing in my living room that evening, staring at the fireplace where Vivienne had discovered Edmund's secret, I realized I wasn't just living in someone else's house. I was living in someone else's tomb. And if Vivienne had really escaped as her diary suggested, then somewhere behind that stone wall was the prison Edmund had built for his wife. The house suddenly didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a witness waiting 50 years to finally tell the truth. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after reading Vivienne's diary. Every time I walked past that fireplace, I felt like I could hear her voice echoing from behind the stone. My brother Garrison called me Thursday morning and immediately knew something was wrong. "Cord, you sound terrible. What's going on up there?" "I think there's a room behind my living room wall. I think someone was kept there against their will." The silence stretched between us before he said, "Pack your stuff. Come stay with me and Rachel until you figure this out." "I can't just leave, Garrison. What if I'm the only person who can finally give Vivienne the justice she deserved? What if you're putting yourself in danger for someone who's been dead for 50 years? That question haunted me, but it also strengthened my resolve. Dead or alive, Vivienne deserved to have her story told. She deserved for someone to care enough to look for the truth. I drove into town that afternoon and spent hours at the local library, combing through newspaper archives and public records. What I found made my decision for me. Vivienne's sister, Delphine, had spent years trying to get someone to investigate her disappearance properly. She had written letters to police, hired a private investigator, even offered a reward for information. In a 1976 newspaper interview, Delphine said, "My sister would never abandon her family without a word. Something terrible happened in that house, and everyone is just pretending it didn't." Back home, I stood in front of the fireplace and really studied it for the first time. Using my restoration training, I examined the stonework carefully. The mortar around certain sections looked newer than the rest, and the pattern of stones didn't quite match on the right side. When I tapped along the wall, I could hear distinct differences in the sound. Parts of it were clearly hollow. I called my former colleague Maven at the Boston Museum. We had worked together on several projects where we needed to examine structures without damaging them. "Maven, I need to borrow some equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging if you have it." "Cordelia, what exactly are you looking for?" "I think there's a hidden room in my house. I think someone might have been trapped there in the 1970s. Maven didn't ask any more questions. She drove up the next day with a car full of professional equipment, the kind museums use to examine walls for hidden artwork or structural damage. The thermal imaging confirmed what I suspected. There was definitely an empty space behind the fireplace wall, roughly the size of a small bedroom. The radar shows the space extends about 8 feet back and maybe 10 feet wide, Maven said, studying the readings. There's definitely an opening somewhere, probably sealed up. That evening, after Maven left, I sat on my living room floor staring at the wall and weighing my options. I could call the police, but what would I tell them? That I found an old diary and some suspicious stonework. They'd think I was a paranoid new homeowner with an overactive imagination. I could sell the house and walk away, pretend I never found Vivienne's belongings or discovered the inconsistencies in the wall. But every time I considered that option, I thought about Delphine, who had spent years fighting for answers that never came. I thought about Vivienne's final diary entry, her determination to escape whatever Edmund had planned for her. On Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after moving in, I made my decision. I called Maven and asked her to stay on the phone with me while I carefully removed some of the stones from what appeared to be the newest section of the wall. If something happens to me, I told her, call the police and tell them to search behind the fireplace in the living room. Using a hammer and chisel from my restoration toolkit, I began working on the mortar around one of the stones that sounded most hollow. My hands shook as the first stone came loose, revealing nothing but darkness behind it. But I could feel air movement, confirming there was definitely a space back there. As I removed the second stone, the smell hit me. Not death, thank God, but the musty scent of a space that had been sealed for decades. And something else, something that made my heart race. The faint smell of old perfume, as if someone had been trapped there long enough to leave their presence permanently embedded in the air. With Maven still on the phone, I removed enough stones to create an opening large enough to crawl through. The darkness beyond was absolute, but my flashlight revealed something that made my breath catch in my throat. This wasn't just a hidden space. It was a room, deliberately constructed and furnished like a prison cell disguised as a bedroom. Maven, I'm going in. Cordelia, maybe you should wait for the police. If I wait, I might lose my nerve. I squeezed through the opening and stood up in what had once been someone's nightmare. The room was roughly 10 by 12 feet, with no windows and only the entrance I had just created. Against one wall sat a narrow bed with a thin mattress, still made up with sheets that had probably been white 50 years ago. A small wooden table held a pitcher and basin for washing. In the corner was a primitive toilet setup behind a makeshift privacy screen. But it was the walls that told the real story. Every surface was covered in scratches, words, and marks. Some were carved deep into the stone with what must have been a nail or piece of metal. Others were written in what looked like pencil or charcoal. As I moved my flashlight across the walls, I could see the progression of someone's imprisonment written in desperate detail. Near the door in shaky handwriting, Day 1, he says this is temporary until I learn to appreciate what he's given me. Further along, Day 23, no one is coming. Delphine doesn't know where I am. And then in darker, more determined strokes, Day 67, I will not die in this room. But it was what I found near the floor that changed everything. Behind the bed, hidden where someone lying down could work secretly, were loose stones. Vivienne had been slowly, carefully working at the mortar around several stones near the foundation, and carved into the wall in tiny letters, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were the words, I found the way out. If someone finds this, I made it to the river path. Tell my sister Delphine in Montreal I tried to come home. Maven, she escaped. Vivienne got out of here. How do you know? I crawled behind the bed and shone my light into the space where the stones had been removed. There was a tunnel, roughly carved but definitely passable, that led down and away from the house. The work was crude but determined, carved by someone who refused to give up hope. Back in my kitchen, laptop open on the counter, I started searching for any trace of what happened to Vivienne after March 1974. Public records showed no death certificate in Vermont. No marriage records under her maiden name after 1974. It was as if she had simply vanished. Then I tried a different approach. I searched Canadian immigration records for 1974, and there it was. A Vivienne Walsh, age 24, crossed the border from Vermont into Quebec on March 18, 1974, just 3 days after her final diary entry. More searching revealed that Vivienne Walsh had lived in Montreal under that name until her death in 2019. She had worked as a teacher, never married, but had been close to her extended family there. Her obituary mentioned her surviving niece, Celeste Walsh, and that she had been a quiet advocate for women's shelters throughout her life. The most shocking discovery came when I found a legal notice from 2019. Vivienne had left a sealed statement with a Montreal law firm, with instructions to release it only after both she and Edmund Whitmore were dead. The notice said the statement contained information relevant to events at the Whitmore estate in 1974, and that it would be made available to appropriate authorities. I called the law firm the next morning. The lawyer, a kind woman named Isabelle, confirmed that Vivienne's statement detailed her imprisonment and escape from the Stone Mansion. She wanted the truth known, but only when she could no longer be hurt by it, Isabelle explained. Mr. Whitmore died in 1978, but Vivienne lived with the fear that he had allies who might come looking for her. Sitting in that hidden room the next evening, I realized I wasn't just uncovering a 50-year-old crime. I was fulfilling a promise Vivienne had made to herself when she carved those desperate words into the stone. That someday, someone would find her prison and tell the world what Edmund Whitmore had done. The house had chosen me, just like grandmother Theodora always said, but not to be its next victim. It had chosen me to be Vivienne's voice. The first thing I did was call Celeste Walsh in Montreal. My hands trembled as I dialed the number the lawyer had given me. When she answered, I took a deep breath and said, "My name is Cordelia Hayes. I live in the house where your Aunt Vivienne was held prisoner in 1974. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she had hung up. Then I heard her crying. "We always knew," she whispered. Aunt Vivienne never talked about those years, but she would wake up screaming sometimes. She never felt safe in small rooms. She always slept with the windows open, even in winter. We knew something terrible had happened to her. Celeste drove down from Montreal the following weekend. She was a teacher like Vivienne had been, with the same delicate features and determined expression I had seen in the old photos. Standing together in that hidden room, we read Vivienne's carved words aloud. It felt like a memorial service 50 years overdue. "She saved herself," Celeste said, running her fingers over the escape tunnel Vivienne had carved. "That's so like her. Even as a little girl, she never waited for someone else to solve her problems." Working with Vivienne's statement and the evidence I had found, we contacted the Vermont State Police. Detective Morrison, who handled cold cases, was amazed by the preservation of the scene. "This is the most complete evidence of domestic imprisonment I've ever encountered," he told us. "Your discovery finally gives Vivienne's family the official validation they fought for decades to receive." The story made national news within a week. Woman discovers 50-year-old prison in dream home, ran on every major network. But more importantly, it sparked conversations about domestic violence and the women who disappear into controlling relationships. Vivienne's story, her courage to carve her way to freedom literally through stone, inspired people across the country. I could have sold the house after all the media attention died down. The notoriety had actually increased its value significantly. Instead, I chose to honor what the house had become to me, a symbol of survival and transformation. I converted the mansion into the Vivienne Liberation Retreat, a place where women recovering from abusive relationships could come to heal and rebuild their strength. The hidden room became the heart of the retreat. We preserved Vivienne's carvings exactly as she left them, but we added warm lighting, comfortable seating, and artwork created by the women who stay with us. It's no longer a prison. It's a testimony to the unbreakable nature of the human spirit. 6 months after opening the retreat, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a letter from Delphine, now 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Montreal. "Cordelia, Vivienne always said that house would choose someone worthy to tell her story. She believed in fate, in things happening for a reason. When she carved those words into the stone, she wasn't just leaving a message for anyone who might find it. She was leaving it for you specifically, though she didn't know your name yet. Thank you for proving her faith was justified." The letter included a photo I had never seen before. Vivienne at age 30, standing in a Montreal park, laughing at something outside the frame. Her face was radiant, completely free of the fear I had imagined she must have carried. She had not just survived Edmund's attempt to destroy her. She had built a beautiful life in spite of it. Today, when women arrive at the retreat broken and afraid, I take them to Vivienne's room and show them those carved words. I tell them about a young woman who refused to accept that a locked door meant the end of her story. I watch their faces change as they realize that if Vivienne could carve her way through stone with nothing but determination and hope, They can carve their way through whatever walls are holding them back. The house chose me, just like grandmother Theodora always said it would. But I think it chose me not to be its owner, but to be its storyteller. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is make sure the right story gets told, even if it takes 50 years to find someone brave enough to tell it. Vivienne got her justice, and I got something even more valuable, the knowledge that even our darkest moments can become the foundation for someone else's freedom.